we know many of our members, whether they're retailers, whether they're manufacturers, or even ranges, are being impacted by discriminatory practices in the financial industry, in the insurance industry, in social media. I mean, we can run down the line and continue to, come up with places where they've been discriminated against. So we took a concerted effort a few years ago to move forward with the FIND Act.
Welcome to Bullet Points, your source for firearm industry news. In this episode, we're going to be talking with Jake McWiggin. He's NSSF's Managing Director of State Affairs, and he's going to be sharing with us some of the successes we've had across the nation in state capitals. Jake, welcome. I saw in the headlines recently that there had been more pro-gun bills passed than ever before. Can you tell us about what really has been going on state by state?
Yep. Eric, well, I appreciate you having me today to talk about what, my state team has done across the country. We have regional guys based across the entire country focusing on both protecting the firearm industry and also doing proactive stuff that is very important to our members across the board. And as you mentioned, that Axios article has talked about how this legislative session, there has been more pro-gun legislation passed in these states than obviously anti-gun stuff. You see that more and more. Obviously, the media wants to cover what they want to cover, so people may have a think differently as to what's being told to them via the media. But we have had some tremendous success this year. And two areas that I want to really highlight is the merchant code category and the FIND Act. And for those that don't know what the FIND Act is, that's the Firearm Industry Non-Discrimination Act. Both of those have been obviously very important victories for us across the country.
And on that FIND Act, maybe let's dig into that a little bit more. Not a little more expansive on what it is and where essentially we've had successes with this bill.
So the FIND Act, this goes back a few years ago where we had basically started the ball rolling in Texas. We passed the FIND Act in Texas a few years ago. And what it essentially does is we know many of our members, whether they're retailers, whether they're manufacturers, or even ranges, are being impacted by discriminatory practices in the financial industry, in the insurance industry, in social media. I mean, we can run down the line and continue to, come up with places where they've been discriminated against. So we took a concerted effort a few years ago to move forward with the FIND Act, and Texas was a huge victory for us. And what it specifically says, and the language we've been pushing in a lot of these states, is that the state is not allowed to contract with financial institutions that basically have discriminatory practices in place. So what that does is it limits these financial institutions from writing bond business, municipal bonds, state bonds, all the way down the line in many of these states. And we feel, and we've seen it specifically, impact them tremendously. So the hope in the future is that as we pass this in more states, that we will have an effort or concerted effort to move the needle and change some of these practices within these institutions.
Right. So the backing up, and this is essentially a reaction to in the private sector, banking sector, their overreaction essentially to trying to limit Second Amendment rights of Americans, right?
Correct. And we've seen that not just our industry, but across many industries, in the country with the ESG movement, basically trying to force financial institutions, pension funds, investments, mutual funds from not investing in what they would consider industries that they don't look upon favorably, whether it be oil and gas, whether it be firearms, whether it be even nowadays agriculture, amazingly is now under the microscope for many of these organizations.
Yeah. So they're essentially trying to choke off the industry, the supply of firearms to U.S. citizens who have legal right to bear arms, and then
With the Find Act, they are trying to do that. They're trying to choke off financing to our manufacturers. So if you don't, you can't extend credit, you can't extend financing, you can't increase capital for our manufacturers and for our retailers. We've seen it in the past with credit card processing. Credit card processors were not going to process transactions for our industry. So we had, obviously had heard enough from our members. We have seen it, and we wanted to do something that would be positive for them and positive for their businesses. This year we've had tremendous success in passing the Find Act across this country.
So where did we get our first success with the Find Act?
So this year, the first success, as I mentioned earlier, was the Texas bill a couple years ago. And we've obviously been able to use that momentum and move forward in states like Georgia and Wyoming. And this session, we've had success in Montana, Utah, Florida, Iowa, and South Dakota via an executive order or executive action that Governor Nome put forth. I really would like to point to the Florida Find Act specifically. That was a very large, encompassing anti-ESG bill that included our firearms language, the state contracting piece that we've done in many other states. And what I want to point out to our members is that if you have a Texas and a Florida moving forward with the Find Act, that's two very large states that have a very large population base, which we believe will move the needle on many of these financial institutions and pulling back on their use the term woke agenda or policies that they have in place.
Jake, you mentioned ESG. It's obviously an acronym, but for those who don't know, what is ESG?
So ESG is basically what we've seen across this country of corporations, and I used the term before, woke policies, or taking what they consider social responsibility. It's basically stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. And what that is again, those corporations that feel the need to push forward an agenda, whether it's anti-firearms, whether it's anti-agriculture, fossil fuels. We're seeing it against private prisons or even defense contractors. So it's basically what they believe is, in their mind, being socially responsible. So that's what we really are pushing back against on the ESG bills.
So they essentially see a constitutionally protected right, and they think they could do something outside the governmental means, right?
Yeah, what's happening is in their opinion, they're not seeing enough movement on the federal level, passing gun control, and in the state level, depending on the state you're in, we have quite a dichotomy of blue states and red states and firearms policies in many of those states. So they feel, okay, fine, we're not seeing what we want to see in many of these states and the federal government. So we're going to do our own thing, whether that chokes off financing or impacts the industry. That's what many of them feel they want to do. We've seen it recently in the news with many companies taking stances on various topics that, in some instances have been backfired against them. Of my opinion specifically is, you're in the business to sell a product. Why would you want to fragment your market at all? Why would you want to basically, create a situation where maybe 50% of the people that are purchasing your product are unhappy with your stance? So, they all should have a fiduciary responsibility to do what's good for their investors and what's good for their company. And many of them at this current time are not doing that.
So now, these bills, the Find Act doesn't just protect. We've mentioned, the supply of manufacturers. It's really on the retail level as well. Ranges need obviously funding to open new ranges for people to go and shoot. For everyday people like you and I want to go purchase a firearm. There were some concerns that we recently had a conversation about the merchant codes, and you mentioned those, but that's primarily on the retail level. Is that correct?
Yes. So on the retail level, what we have seen, and this was again a concerted effort by one bank in New York City called Amalgamated Bank, that moved forward what we call the merchant code category, the MCC. What they wanted to do was basically create a firearms code for firearms retailers and manufacturers. Many of the credit card companies, the Visas, the MasterCards of the world, did not want to kind of go down that road. They knew it was not a political exercise they wanted to really be involved in, but Amalgamated went kind of behind the scenes, worked with international bodies to create this merchant code category. So with that development, NSSF took a step forward to say, okay, we need to find ways to restrict this. At the end of the day, we didn't need retailers and we don't need any firearms owners feeling nervous that just because they use their credit card, they're going to be included in a database somewhere, or their purchases are being tracked, or their transactions are being tracked. So that specifically was Oedipus for us to move forward with the merchant code category legislation. And what that basically does is, in these states, it restricts the credit card processors from using the merchant code category for firearms or for firearms retailers. And this year, we have seen this really explode. A lot of the states have concerns about protecting the privacy of firearms owners and gun owners, and as well as our retailers. And so this year, again, it just recently, the most recent passage was in Texas and Florida. Both states passed a restriction or prohibiting the use of the merchant code for firearms retailers. Along with that, we've passed it in Montana, Idaho, West Virginia, Mississippi, and North Dakota. What I do want to point out is that we do have some blue states that are trying to go in the opposite direction. As many would imagine, California is now trying to move legislation that would enforce the merchant code category, enforce everyone to use it. So we've seen that as well, and obviously we'll be working against that. But California legislature is not very firearms friendly, as many on watching this video
No,
will understand.
you're kidding. Right. So with the kind of the controversial point of this whole thing is really boils down to, I would think, is, you said gun registry. I mean, it essentially creates a backdoor gun registry.
Yeah, I mean, right now, of course, they paint the picture of, oh, it's just like another category that shows up at the end of the year credit card statement where it shows where you've spent money, what categories you spent money on. But at the end of the day, we all know it's an end around or workaround for registration. Many of the data that would be collected is probably going to be shared for political purposes, and that's the main reason why we're working so hard to restrict those merchant code usage across this country. And again, with the passage into Texas and Florida, we have heard from many in the industry or in the credit card industry mentioning that, hey, we can't have all these patchwork laws. So as this current time, they don't believe they're going to be moving forward with that because of how many states have passed restrictions this year.
Good. So what is the overall kind of outlook for things as we close sessions now?
So we have, as we close sessions, I mean, proactively, we've done the fair majority of our work. Obviously in the red states, in the pro-gun states, and many of those sessions have ended. Currently, we are still facing some battles more on the defensive end in some of the northeastern states and on the West Coast. So we will continue to fight those fights here for the next month or so until some of these sessions end. But most of the proactive work that we've had and we've accomplished, we're probably at the tail end of that for that now. We're just going to do our best to protect our members and their interests in some of the not so friendly states across the country.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jake. Thanks to you, and extend our thanks to the rest of the team for all that they're doing out there state by state. Really appreciate you being on with us. Hope to get you again soon.
Great. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you for watching this episode of Bullet Points. Join us next time for more industry news.